In 1942, I was in the University of Pennsylvania at the time of Pearl Harbor, and I realized that I would be called, but I would graduate first, so I could go into the Supply Corps as a graduate of a business school, starting off with a commission of lieutenant junior grade, and instead I decided to go into what they termed the V5 program, which was a Navy classification for pilot training. And I was called to active duty in December of 1942 and enlisted in the Navy at that time. The carrier had about 12 or 1,500 people on the carrier. This is the USS Langley, which was originally put down to be a fast cruiser. And President Roosevelt, before we went into the war, took it on himself to take 9 of these to-be cruisers and converted them to aircraft carriers, which turned out to be very fortunate because we didn't have enough carriers when the war broke out. And these were good, but they were narrow enough. They were very difficult to operate a plane from, but still a very successful aircraft carrier. This was a home for about six or 7 months, something like that. The plane we flew in combat was the F6F Hellcat, which was a very sturdy plane, a very well-performing plane, and a plane with a lot of forgiveness. It was an excellent plane on the carriers. And of course, a very durable plane. And it fared very well in combat with the Zero. This is one of the Hellcats that just landed, and here is the tail hook on one of these cables across that pulled him to a dead stop. These are crew member deck hands that came out and pulled the wire off so he could taxi on up. There were a number of pilots that were washed out in their training because they got airsick all the time. They just couldn't help it. It was very sad to go through that with a friend that washed out just because he got sick all the time. Well, I would tell you an interesting one about the Halsey Typhoon. This was, Halsey took the fleet into a typhoon, and during one evening, 3 destroyers capsized. And it happened of the 4 carriers in my group of carriers, in what was called 38.3, only the Langley had planes that were able to be taken off the deck because they'd been tried to store them down in the hangar and other things, or that some of them broke loose and there were a lot of accidents. But at any rate, they selected these 4 planes, and I was one of them. My plane was cabled down on the port side of the ship, fully aft, and they kept the cables on to hold the plane down while they put the first 3 up on the catapult at the forward end of the carrier and launched them by catapulting. It was taking so long that the captain of the ship decided he would try to run me down the deck for the takeoff. With a combination of the roll into the left and the torque of the engine pulling the plane shot right out in the ocean, landed upside down with me in it. Now, the lucky part of this experience was that the airplane tore off a very large life raft on the side of the carrier. So when I came up right beside this, the raft, and climbed on, and a destroyer picked me up from that to recover me. Without that raft, they would never have found me in the seas. My experience with the P-38 was an interesting one. We had been on an assignment. All of the fighter planes on the Langley that I was stationed with were on that flight, and we were attacking the Japanese fleet in near the Leyte Gulf. And we came in at about 10,000 feet and started to form a straight line to fly in and then circle the ships to make a simultaneous dive from all directions to spread the anti-aircraft fire. As we started forming our line, a bogey was dropping down on us, and the commander of our squadron that was leading that flight told me to roll off and take him. And as I did, I saw it wasn't a Japanese bogey, it was a P-38 diving on us. Well, at that point, I turned back to make my dive all by myself, and the sky just opened up dark below me with anti-aircraft fire. And one of the explosions put a piece of shrapnel miraculously through the propeller, missing the propeller, not damaging the propellers, but it cut the top of the cylinder off with the rocker arm box that pumped the oil down in the cylinders. And that, so I, at that point, I jettisoned my propeller, or my canopy, and I'm prepared because my engine was missing badly, and also it knocked my radio out. So at any rate, I proceeded to drop my bomb and pull out, and by that time my planes had all formed and we were returning to the carrier. So I was out by myself at that point. A fighter from the Essex that had the next wave of attack on these Japanese ships, one of their men flew up alongside me and gave me the Morse code by tapping on your head to follow him. And he brought me back to the carrier. And that ended up with another rather tight landing because the oil was pumping so badly on the windshield, it was hard to see the landing signal officer on the deck. And that was the beginning of the trouble. But when I put additional power on, it increased the heat of the engine, catching all of this oil on fire. So I landed with my engine burning and getting down on the deck. It wasn't a very good landing, but it was a pleasant one for me. Halsey had decided to send planes down in the China Sea. The ships never went down that far, but there were probably 8 different carriers that sent planes down. That penetration was way down. I flew over Hanoi on that flight. And the main interest of that was the very fact we did go into the China Sea, and the other one was the length of the attack. It was a very long flight. But I was in on that battle of the first battle into the China Sea. That was one of my flights over the Philippines and Formosa, and then above that was Aishima, the island where Ernie Pyle was later killed. And we made that first attack. That was one of the missions I made. It was an interesting one. There was strange weather. As we approached the island, the sky was absolutely black, like just a wall of dense fog right to the edge of the water. So we had to dive under that and then attack and strafe the airfield. And it is primarily the fact that later Ernie Pyle was killed there that made that somewhat outstanding in my memory. Well, I was ready to go, but of course it was a tense moment. And one problem was that the Wildcat had very narrow landing gears that would ground loop on the ground. So I was terribly worried I would ground loop this plane in landing, but it worked out all right. Yeah, we had the highest fatalities of any fighter squadron during my term of service out in the fleet. We had had 24 original fighter pilots, and 12 of those didn't finish the war. And the torpedo planes, our carrier carried only fighter planes and torpedo planes. There were 14 torpedo pilots, the original ones, and only 4 of them survived that trip. Any Navy man that crossed the equator, going down to below the equator, in crossing they have a ceremony, and Imperial Neptune reigns, and an enlisted man was King Neptune that day. He was a master senior enlisted man that had crossed several times himself. He was a lifetime Navy man, and he enjoyed the initiation. The various squadrons had a name that they selected for themselves. Instead of being the Red Devils or something like that, we were the Crusaders, and I was assigned the job to create our insignia. So I went back into heraldry in the library up in Maine where we were stationed, and created this. These in heraldry are the bastard stripes in the families back in heraldry. These are various signs. Now the fighter squadron was the falcon and the dagger and the bastards. We would call ourselves the bastards. And the insignia for the torpedo planes was a long spear and something else. I forget now what we did to try, but that's our insignia that I created for that purpose. The Navy released veterans or naval personnel on a merit basis consisting of the period of time they'd been in the service, the military experiences, the combat they'd have, and so forth. So I had been accepted, my application for law school at the University of Pennsylvania. And so in the beginning of September, I was released and returned to Philadelphia. I wore my uniform for 10 days to class before I could get civilian dress. So I went through that experience. I was treated very well. The Navy was good to me and good for me. And they did award me a Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal, and also a very nice letter from Secretary of the Navy Forrestal thanking me. Not that all the other Navy people didn't get one also, but it was appreciated.